Back when I was studying for the LSAT, I wasted far too much time getting overly wrapped up in the 15 different types of logical reasoning questions, when instead, I should have focused on the big overarching themes across the logical reasoning section. Today, I'll share with you how to ace the LSAT by doubling down on logical reasoning. For those who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005, and I personally increased my own LSAT score from a 152 to a 175. Now, my big breakthrough in logical reasoning came when I stopped thinking about the LSAT question stem type and instead started thinking about the method of reasoning in the stimulus. Because, surprise, surprise, if you actually take the time to understand what you're reading, the question and solving it becomes a whole lot easier. Now, there are roughly 15 different types of logical reasoning questions: must be true, strengthen, weaken, flaw, necessary assumption, sufficient assumption, and beyond. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't learn those. I'm not saying that you shouldn't drill those. But at a certain point, you've got to move on beyond just drilling questions by question stem type and instead double down, focus on making sure you understand the method of reasoning in the stimulus. Now, one strategy I've developed to help you do just that is called the Socratic review method. It's a cornerstone of my LSAT courses and my one-on-one LSAT coaching programs. And the idea here is, in your review process, you take the time to slow down and thoroughly understand the argument, understand the question stem, and understand the answer choices, particularly what makes the wrong answer choices tempting and what ultimately makes them wrong, what makes the right answer choice unappealing, and what ultimately makes it correct. Because you have these traps of encouragement towards the wrong answer and traps of discouragement away from the right answer. And until you understand precisely what mistakes you're making and why, you can't help but end up making them again. And so at LSAT Unplugged, we demonstrate the Socratic review method live in our small group classes and in our one-on-one coaching programs. If you're interested in finding out more, you can check out the links below to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out. Now, of course, all of this is regardless of the question stem type. You also want to make sure that you are crystal clear on the basics of the questions, like conditional indicators for necessary and sufficient conditions, evidence and conclusion indicators. These will carry you far, and if you don't know them, you're in trouble. You also want to make sure that you do master the core logical reasoning question types, like necessary assumption, inference, and flaw, before tackling the less common types, like evaluate the argument. Now, why am I focusing on logical reasoning in this video? In part, it's because it's 2/3 of the test now that logic games has been removed from the LSAT, and so any gains you make in logical reasoning will be automatically doubled across the two sections. Now, I know for a lot of you out there, you're still going to go ahead and focus on logical reasoning question types just because it's easy to categorize questions in that way. So today I'm going to share with you 3 quick wins for logical reasoning based on question stem types that you can implement right away. First and foremost, and this is one of the biggest mistakes I see students making, is that you want to be crystal clear on the difference between necessary assumption questions and sufficient assumption questions. They are asking for very different things. A lot of students don't even distinguish between the two types, and a lot of prep companies also don't distinguish between the two types. And so you tell the difference based on the keyword or phrase in the question stem. Necessary assumption questions contain words and phrases synonymous with necessity, and sufficient assumption questions contain words and phrases synonymous with sufficiency. Necessary terms would be things like depends upon, requires, and assumes. Those would be your keywords to look for. Sufficient assumption questions, you'd look for keywords and phrases like allows, enables, follows logically if assumed, and properly inferred if assumed. That's quick win number 1. Now, quick win number 2 is to distinguish between must be true questions and most strongly supported questions. You could bucket them under the catch-all category of inference questions, but there is a slight distinction here where must be true questions require 100% certainty or 100% support from the stimulus. Most strongly supported questions allow a little bit of wiggle room where the correct answer is incredibly likely based on the stimulus, but is not necessarily 100% guaranteed. Now, finally, quick win number 3 here is to recognize that a weakener does not mean to necessarily destroy the argument. A lot of students will say, well, a weakened question correct answer doesn't eliminate the validity of the argument, and my contention is that it does not have to. It simply has to make the conclusion relatively less likely given the evidence, but it could still allow for the possibility of the argument to work, even if it is at least a little bit somewhat weakened. Now, of course, when you're studying logical reasoning, as I said, you want to make sure you master the most common question types before tackling the ones that hardly ever show up. Of course, in our courses, we cover all 15 plus types of logical reasoning questions, plus the most important methods of reasoning, because it's not always about the question stem types. So again, if you're scoring below 160, you want to focus on the most common types of logical reasoning questions. Again, necessary assumption, inference, and flaw. If you're scoring above 160, that's great. It's then time to take your prep to the next level and start thinking about the methods of reasoning a bit more, like correlation, causation, confusing necessary sufficient conditions and such. So reach out through the link below to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out. Now, if you really want to level up your prep and you want to make sure you're clear on the methods of reasoning that'll likely show up more often going forward, like numbers and percentages, absolute versus relative values, and formal logic stimuli, long story short, LSAT is testing these concepts more than ever before because they can no longer test them in logic games, since of course logic games is no longer on the test. And so if you're aiming for 170 plus, you definitely want to be solid on those particular methods of reasoning. So again, if you'd like my help with those, check out the links below. We'd be glad to help. And in the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.